Hello.
Hello.
Good morning.
Good morning. The 9 a.m. one is hard for a lot of people.
I'm a morning person. This is great.
Yeah, I've only been up for 3 hours out here on the West Coast so far. Harder in the winter when the sun does not come up until 8 o'clock. But in the summer, easy.
Yeah, I am so much more able to take like a 7 or 8 a.m. meeting than like a 4:30 or like 5 p.m. meeting. Like sign me up for the mornings. I'm there. Anything after 4 p.m. though, like oof, my brain's already gone. I think we've got just about everybody. I see Max joined, Sertaj is here. JDip, do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, sure.
First item there.
Yeah. So this is related to reporting compliant resource for which policies already exist, since we already get everything that we are supposed to get to run policies through, and only report the ones that are in violation. I was curious if anybody had any thoughts on or are there any like road blocks that we would need to figure out for this to also be implemented, and are there any edge cases for this?
Yeah, not really. I would probably not enable it by default just for like volume of reporting purposes, and I wouldn't report it on something like on the constraint where you have space constrained reporting, but for like logout and pub sub, sure.
That makes sense. Where would this be reported? Yeah, I kind of had not yet time to figure that out, that where would we be reporting this, but as makes sense, yeah, it does make sense to not take up space on constraint statuses, and like log or pub sub makes sense.
Right, and we are gathering by resource. Sorry for a second, as like if we were iterating over constraints rather than over resources, there might have been memory concerns with storing the results, but because we're getting all violations for every resource every time, yeah, this is feasible.
Yeah.
Especially since now we have pops up. I think logs would have been too much for this, for like a larger clusters with like a lot of violations. But I think it's more doable in pops up.
Maybe I feel like they both have like not the same scaling concerns, but scaling concerns in different ways, right? Like even for large clusters, I think logs could work. You're going to see the possibility of saturating the channel unless you scale it. In either case, right? For pub sub, you need to have the bandwidth for all the events per second that you're going to get. For logs, same kind of thing, right? You'll need the IOPS or the buffer size or whatever, however your log system is architected.
Yeah, I think for logs, the limitation is the container logs, I think, which we may or may not be able to modify. because otherwise they get rotated pretty quickly. I think like 5 or 10 megabytes is the limit, so and then they'll just get rotated. I think PubSub allows us to be more flexible because we can manage that thing like the Redis cache and all that other like the buffer channels and whatnot.
Gotcha. It sounds like we want to enable supporting for so we want to support enabling logging of non-violation reporting of non-violation in both venues, but we don't necessarily want to couple that config, if that makes sense. Then like PubSub can be
Yeah.
enabled independently of logging.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And-
that makes sense to me. Because if there are too many non-violating resources, then it will also rotate the violating ones, which may or may not something that the user wants.
Right. And whether it even does rotate, it depends on the logging infrastructure.
Oh yeah, I guess like if you are like following the logs like very diligently, I guess that may not rotate.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like you could use syslog to basically create a PubSub system, for instance.
That's true. Yeah.
Cool.
So the decision is basically we're okay to start with like a design doc on the on this, right? Do you want to take note, JDIP, on the doc?
Yeah.
Curious, was there like an ask on Slack or, I mean, I see JDIP created an issue, so I'm kind of curious how many people need this?
We had a user ask on our site. I can't talk to you about this.
Okay, all right.
It does make sense though, because like audit is kind of like has this aliasing effect over time, right? This tearing effect. An audit session could take like 30 minutes or whatever. So knowing whether a given resource was actually audited or not is not a trivial thing without a specific log.
Mm.
All right, sounds like we'll go forward with the
Um,
design doc on that one.
I actually can't edit the doc, so
Yeah.
I just
I think that since we made the move to the drive, it was probably open before, so we can either like open the doc for anyone to edit, or we'll have to add anyone that's missing still.
I thought we at least made it open for comments for
It
everyone.
is open for comments, yeah.
And
Which
and
means we should-
suggestions.
Yeah.
And periodically the permissions will get removed and we have to ask again. This has been a point of pain.
Hmm.
It does happen periodically. Like all of us would not have access and then we have to ask.
Who is doing this and why don't they trust us?
Rita, do you want to talk about optional versus required sync?
Yeah. Let me just pull up that issue. So I think for this particular PR, it adds the require labels to an existing policy. And it seems like it's also optional, like the way it's written, it feels like the UX is the require sync data is optional. But then as far as I understand, once you add the annotation, it's not an optional thing, right? If you could scroll down to my comment, I think this is where it got confusing for me.
To be pedantic, the parameter that turns on the selected by service bit is the thing that makes it so that synced data is salient. but then we're talking about there's an annotation that basically says, hey, this constraint template will not work without synced data, and that's an all or nothing config that we would flip. And so there's no way to really have this nuance. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, because if you look at the rego, right, I think like only services parameter makes it optional.
Yeah.
Yeah, I did add a note, and Max, I didn't see your ping till this morning for some reason, but the other thing is, I'm not sure that actually any enforcement of this is used further down the line. So I guess the only thing I would throw out right now is Gatekeeper only in 3.13 beta 1 added support for unmarshalling it, but it doesn't do anything with it at this point. And so I guess the other question is, what's the UX for that experience? If it's just like a warning or a log, then maybe it's not such a big deal, would be my only thought, versus it actually blocks the the template from being put in place if it notices that it's not configured. So I don't know what the plan is there either. So
Yeah,
I guess I'm asking more of a question on how is this, what's the main consumer of this, and what does it do it, because that may make maybe an important thing is whether or not whether this matters that much, because right now just adding the annotation doesn't do anything.
yeah, I get that, because it's, it's available whenever the release has that code, right? Like that part, it's always going to be a shifting target kind of thing. But my question was more on in the future when we add require labels to an existing, require sync to an existing, it's more of a question when to use this annotation. Is this an optional thing or is this required? So it doesn't have anything to do with releases or anything. Does that make sense?
Well, I would say that it does have impact on like the roadmap and what people can do, though, right? Because like near term, we're looking to build a thing that looks at constraint templates and generates corresponding sync sets, right? And you could imagine, or even just like a linter, right, that reads the templates you have and then outputs, hey, you have the sync sets that you need or you don't, right? And so this could erroneously create a sync set, right? Or could give a false positive that, hey, you need a sync set when in fact you don't, which may or may not be harmful, right? The impact of having unnecessary sync sets, obviously there's a memory impact, because you need to cache the objects that are being synced in RAM. There's also potentially a surface impact, right? If for whatever reason people really don't want to cache referential data, either because they don't want to deal with the eventual consistency concerns, or they view the idea of caching objects as inherently insecure, then what is their next steps for something like this, right? Do they then need to like investigate the source code of the constraint templates or something like that, build out some exception? Or are they just like not going to use this constraint template? So there is like some friction there if you're a user who doesn't want to sync.
Alex, did you have your hand up for a while?
Oh yeah. Yeah, I just wanted to respond to Andrew's like, what's the UX? So I pasted a link to that. And then I just wanted to say that I'm confused by an optional annotation. Like how
I
would
think
that
the
work?
problem is there isn't an optional annotation right now.
Well, I think like the whole idea of an optional annotation is confusing to me. Like, what would the difference be between like a require sync annotation and an optional require sync? Like the errors don't show up, I suppose. is that useful? Do we even want that? Would folks use it, kind of a thing? Like I've not seen this PR that's being shared, so I haven't looked at it.
I would encourage us not to focus so much on the data format right now, but on the actual friction that we have, where there is an annotation that we have on a resource that unambiguously says, if you have this constraint template, it should have sync sets, when in the reality, that may or may not be true depending on the value of the parameter, right? And
Yep.
so from a user level and from a design perspective, the friction is honestly, for me right now, the biggest friction is there's a backwards incompatibility here, right? You could imagine if someone has previously been injecting, been using this constraint template, right? And then we have now this thing where it could require a sync set. If they freeze the version they're using, it's fine, right? So this is a good example of, like, from an API perspective, it looks like it's backwards compatible because we're just adding a parameter, but not really, because if they have this requirement of no. What do we mean by require a sync set? This constraint template has on it an annotation that says you must sync deployments for this constraint template to work. So in order to sync it in this future land where sync sets exist, it's saying I require a sync set.
Whereas in the Rego, we check for the parameter. So if you don't specify that parameter, or it's, it basically says you don't require syncing of that particular data, right? So as you can see, they're conflicting, but then we are actually enforcing, when you have require sync data, we're enforcing that you must be syncing that data. So these are directly conflicting.
Yeah, and go on.
Well, I was just gonna say, I think it's not really possible to figure it out, unfortunately, at that point, because the parameter is set in a constraint, and unfortunately right now the sync set is evaluated at the template level, where, before and maybe not even if there ever is a constraint. So I think the sync set kind of has to be worst case scenario of what the template could ever require, because we don't know what the constraint parameter value will be if it ever even exists. So I think, Max, where I was going to go is I think I'm okay with it being kind of worst case scenario, like anything that ever could need to be synced. But I agree with you that probably this is a breaking change, not a minor change at the very least.
Yeah, to make it personal, if we have a policy controller, for instance, where referential data could be disabled, right? This constraint template used to work and would no longer work in a place where referential data is disabled, right? Because it just wouldn't compile.
Yeah, I would personally, if I was doing the release notes, I would call it out as a breaking change. So yes, yeah, that would be for sure.
Yeah, which is, I think all of this is fine. Like, I think this is reasonable either way. I only really see two solutions here. Either we keep like two separate copies of the constraint template, and one that has this, one that doesn't, or basically this worst case annotation thing, because having something that is sensitive to values of parameters, that's going to wind up being an arbitrarily complex test, right? Like, we don't know in advance what kinds of parameters, what their schema will be, what various combinations of parameters will lead to which external datas will be needed, or referential datas will be needed or not. So I don't think having a more intelligent set of requirements is possible, if that makes sense.
Sorry, maybe this is the morning, but why would this be a breaking change real quick?
You have a constraint template, you have a cluster, right? And you have said, I do not want referential data because of XYZ operational constraints, either because of security concerns or whatever, right? Right now, as it exists, this template does not touch external data, referential data is unquestionably fine. Now it does, right? And so what's interesting is that the parameter change is purely additive. So from that perspective, nothing has changed, right? But from a behavioral perspective, it has changed, right? In this future world where we're reporting errors on the constraint template, now that constraint template has errors where previously it didn't, for instance, right? They might be harmless errors because you don't have that parameter turned on, but automated systems have no way of knowing that, right? If you construct alerting that just like gates itself on the presence or absence of errors, you upgrading this template then will cause that alerting to trigger, for example.
I see. So we are making this template. We are taking this template in this PR from a template that doesn't use referential data to one that does. So it is a different template, right? Like if the rego is modified to support.
Well,
right?
my assertion that it's a breaking change implies that at the very least it's a different minor version of the template, according to our versioning scheme. If I remember right, major version was fully incompatible schema. Maybe I'm wrong. It might be a different major version of the template, which would imply it should be a different template.
I
If
think right
anyone
now
would-
it'd fall under metadata, which is classified as a patch, which is I think kind of the problem, Max. Yeah. Because I don't think anybody
Right.
thought that nobody really thought that adding metadata would make this much of a difference, I guess is what I would say originally. And you didn't used to, right? You know, you changed the title, so what?
Yeah. Well, and to be clear, the metadata is actually just reflective of changes in the code, right? So I think the versioning policy probably covers, hopefully it's worded vaguely enough that it covers like behavioral changes like this. I just forget what the conclusion would be. And we should.
I think it says any other breaking changes, so it's pretty vague there.
Yeah, get them edge cases in the language. Yeah, so
But sorry, just reading the actual policy for versioning, it does say minor version is whenever there is a backward compatible change. I don't think this is backward compatible.
Agreed. Yeah, I would agree as well. It seemed the rego is backwards compatible, but combined with the brand new annotation, it becomes not. That's my
Right,
opinion.
and that's the nature of require sync data feature, right? So yeah, I mean, I think if we want to support this scenario, I will be okay with creating another policy just for it. Because it is different in some sense.
okay,
Yeah.
so we're saying this looks like a V2 constraint template then?
My vote would be to call it required probes referential. Is that like not a pattern that we're using?
That would be a different solution. That would say this is a completely different constraint template, whereas calling it V2 makes it clear that further development will continue only on the V2 of the template.
But
But-
what what if I don't want to use V2 referential, but like I want
Exactly.
I want
I
to like,
was thinking not bump the major, but rather just create a new one. Basically require probes with services or something.
In
which
why
case you
can't we
could
just continue on
deparameterize it.
the last major? Like why can't we do it both at the same time?
To be clear, having a new major version means creating a new template, right? V2 gets appended to the kinds.
I think there's a difference between like deprecation kind of policy with like the older version, like you just said, right? Like going forward, we're only gonna maintain the 2 dot whatever. So what about the people that really don't care about the services?
But
Right,
I don't
so-
think that's true. I mean, we can still maintain the 1.0. If somebody wants a PR, are we going to reject it? Like,
I mean, probably not. The implication, as from a consumer, I think, would be expect V2 to get more love than V1. Like, personally, I'm fine either way. I do think those are the two solutions, though, like 2 separate templates maintained in parallel, or V1 and V2 that, to your point, may or may not be maintained in parallel. And sort of the consumer implication would be from now on use V2, and from a UX, probably if you're using V1 and you can upgrade, you should.
I'm guessing on the websites for both ours and Artifact Hub, V1 won't be visible. Is that right?
It should be visible with the original kind name, right? Because if we create a V2, it'd be a new kind with the K8s required probes V2 is the name. Right? That's my understanding anyway.
Yeah.
So if you wanted to use the V1 template, you would use K8s required probes. If you want to use the V2 template, you'd use K8s required probes V2, basically. I'm not saying that's an ideal solution. That's just my understanding how the V2 would look.
Yeah, I think, yeah, and this is a functional discussion, right? Like, we're not saying, oh, this is the right way. We're just saying, if we did it this way, this is what it would look like.
And yeah, I was gonna say, read it to your comment. I think that's an option. The only thing I would suggest is if we do that, we should have the author remove the parameter, make that the default behavior then. But so.
Sorry, so what do you mean the author removed the behavior?
If it's done as a new, if it's done as a new required probes with services, we should remove the parameter and make that the default behavior. Just
Oh, you mean for
in
the
other words,
old-
abandon it
yes,
trying to be basically
100%
like,
agree. The only
Yeah.
reason you have to do the parameter is because you're trying to make it work for non-required, right?
Yep,
Like,
we're
again, I'm just
100%.
thinking what is easier for the user. Like, if I see 2 of these, I wouldn't know the difference between 1 and 2 until I look at the regos, I guess.
Yeah. No, your comment makes sense. Like, we should document things based off of what they do rather than the qualities of their code, right? Referential, non-referential makes sense, but we could be more descriptive. So with services.
Yeah, I think my preference would be probably more along Rita's suggested name. So like K8s required probes with services or something.
So did we have a conclusion in terms of which we preferred, separate template or new version?
So my personal preference is if it's a breaking change, I think we should just go with a new template based upon the conversation. I'm still trying to think if there's some other clever solution here, but I'm not coming up with one right this second.
It'd be cool if you could like optionally include certain chunks of code.
I think that's way too complicated, like I think you intonated earlier. For such an edge case. Although I was gonna say we'd have to go look through. I'm thinking this as being more of a breaking change than trying to radically rehaul the annotation.
Yeah, like in the future, maybe we could design something where code is optionally include it or not. But yeah, that would not be a simple design or a simple change.
I think the problem with doing that is that if you're going to have it ever based upon a constraint parameter, that would mean you'd have to adjust the sync sets at the once the constraints are created, which I think that's really hard and unlikely to fit in with kind of the pattern on how users are administering their clusters. That's my opinion. Probably whoever's creating the templates is going to have the permissions to adjust the sync information in Gatekeeper, which may or may not be somebody who's applying a constraint to a cluster.
Yeah, it would not be through parameters. It would be a completely separate, unknown system that I cannot, off the top of my head, design. Like it would be a significant design task to figure out a way that does that nicely. So a for now thing, we're stuck with these two options for sure.
Or maybe we're also identifying that maybe there should be a way to mark the required sync data as optional. Like either if you include it, it's required. Like if in the constraint you include it, it's required. If it's not, then I don't know how hard that is though.
I think my only concern with that would be is that now if we've made it optional and somebody did use the parameter, then they would get an incorrect evaluation later saying that it was optional. So I think that would be my concern of going down that path, is if we don't, I think we lose kind of some of the user value then.
Well, I think the difference is it's not optional if you have it in the constraint. It is optional for the constraint author, if that makes sense. Right now, we're kind of saying it's not optional, like the constraint template author decides if it's optional or not. Sorry, the constraint template, as soon as you add it in the constraint template, you're saying this should always be there, right? The sync thing should always be there. It's not optional. But as you just mentioned, this is the perfect example of where it's actually optional for the constraint author.
Right.
Yeah, although I don't think this is currently, this is currently based in the templates, not the constraints, but yeah, no, 100%.
Yeah, you start getting into the halting problem, I think, like prove this bit of code is never accessed. You could maybe, and as touching on this before, in your annotation, you would need like kind of metadata saying like, this parameter means that this constraint template does need it versus doesn't need it. But then whatever syntax needs to probably handle arbitrarily complex cases, right? Like this parameter means that this GVK needs to be synced. That parameter means that that GVK needs to be synced. This combination of parameters needs to be set to a certain kind of value for this set of GVKs to be synced, but not that set. Oh, and by the way, these parameters have like arbitrary schemas, so you're dealing with like subparameters. Yeah, so you could do it, but because of the halting problem thing, you'd be relying on the coder of the constraint template to be very thorough in how they set those tests. And you would essentially be putting embedding a coding language in the annotation. And then also you would need to know the contents of the constraints to make a determination as to whether sync sets exist or not, which if you have like fragmented deployments might alter like shift left workflows, right? Like say your constraint templates live in a different repo than your constraints, right? And whoever's controlling the installation of sync sets doesn't have full visibility at authoring time to all the constraints that might be used with the template, then you just wouldn't have enough information to know whether sync sets are needed or not.
I think that's my concern right there, Max, in particular, which is kind of like where I think you got to go kind of worst case. But anyway, I think the more we talk about it, I think the simple solution is simply have the author fork this as a new template and avoid the topic as being kind of a not likely to come up again. And if it does, this, solve it this way potentially.
Yeah, I think we'll see this again. I don't think we'll see it often.
I think it only matters if you're trying to make it into a backwards compatible change to an existing template, though, in particular, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I think once every few months or maybe a year or so. Yeah. 100%. It's good we have precedent. Or at least a design direction. So just to be super clear, it sounds like we're preferring two different constraint templates rather than upping a major version.
That's my impression from the discussion.
Okay. Is there any other nuance to this or anything anyone wants to point out, or next topic?
I think the only thing I was gonna say is the advantage of V2 is if we thought we were going to eventually retire V1, but it doesn't sound like that's like the direction that makes sense. So that's why I'm supportive of a new one with a slightly different name instead.
Yep. Again, good discussion for future reference.
Yeah. Yeah, and we should comment then, because we want to reference this, we should summarize that on our comment on the issue, because GitHub's probably the most discoverable place this result will wind up. Like, how I interpreted what we're saying is, unless we're deprecating the no referential version of the constraint, just have two in parallel.
I think Rita's typing that as we speak, actually, in the.
Oh, nice. Yeah, we should.
So I stopped.
Gotcha.
Oh,
We should.
Sorry, I typed in the meeting notes. Sorry.
No, that's perfect. I was gonna say, I think everything we were looking for. Yeah, nope. I think you're typing exactly what Max is thinking.
Gotcha. Yeah, so we should copy paste that in the response to the GitHub issue with an apology to Trout for being slow.
It's not so bad. I mean, almost everything could probably be reused, actually. Just fork it, basically. It's
probably easier as a new thing anyway, actually.
Certainly, I'll tell you this, from writing way too many constraint tests, the tests will be a lot easier when you don't have any parameters to worry about and covering different options.
Cool. Shall we move to the next item?
Sure.
Alex, I moved yours up just because I think it's more discussion needed, I think.
Oh yeah, okay, thank you. Okay. Well, I was just gonna signal boost this since neither Julian nor Anlan are here. So I was gonna ask you, Rita, if you had a chance to look over it.
Yeah, I did. I was actually gonna ask questions if I saw them, but they're not here. But maybe others who are part of the discussion could also shed some light. I love the discussion in the chat, in the comments. It wasn't very clear to me where the decisions were, because the doc is like different options, right? But I wasn't looking through the comments, I wasn't clear on which one we landed, and it might be good to add that to the document.
Yeah, that's fair. I don't think, honestly, it's anything in the doc is treated as like option. I think it's descriptive of what Anlan would like to see. Although in the comment, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, specifically, the question around greedy versus optimal, and there was the concern about deterministic, and I 100% think we need to make sure it's deterministic. So again, I wasn't sure, like, does that mean we're we're going with greedy versus optimal. I don't know. That's why I'm asking.
Right, and maybe the doc's changed since last I read it, but my memory of it was her saying that it would default to greedy with a flag for optimal. And I had left a comment saying maybe we start with greedy just to get something out there and then see if optimal winds up being necessary or not. So good.
Can we be sure that greedy is really deterministic? That would be my concern. Echoing, I think, Rita's concern, because I'm worried about thrashing the configurations for end users.
You can, yeah, you can definitely make the output stable for a stable input.
Right, but like I think we want to probably also minimize the potential output changes, even if for very minor changes in inputs, if that kind of makes sense. Like you add one template which uses the same things as already in the solution, but we might end up with a different solution. I think is not ideal. But
like a minor change making a big minor change in input yielding a major change in output.
Exactly, a confusingly big change in output, I guess, is where I'm going.
Yeah. I mean, there's some level of expected change in output, right? Like if a minor change, for instance, raises or lowers the version floor for a GVK that's already synced, you would expect that GVK to be affected, right?
Right, and it's been a long time since I've taken an algorithms class. I'm more worried that if we simply add one that has an existing same requirement, but maybe it gets ingested in a different order, the greedy algorithm might come up with a different solution.
Right. I think it's fair to point that out as a concern in the doc.
Yeah, I'll put a note that it's just I think my thought is right now what we've only got like 4 or 5 templates that even have sync set requirements. I think personally optimal may not be that bad with those kind of numbers. I can't imagine it's a big deal. It's not like we're probably expecting people to have thousands of templates. I suspect their cluster will have far bigger resource problems if they try and do 1,000 CRDs than worrying about like optimal versus greedy, but that's my opinion without testing it. So okay,
Yeah.
I'll put a note on there that I think deterministic is extremely valuable to end users.
Yeah, deterministic for sure, stable for sure, optimal, I don't know. How badly the time scales with the time complexity scales with input size probably would be determinative there. I think a few, I wouldn't necessarily be comfortable assuming, tens of templates, hundreds as a maximum, maybe. That might give us enough runway to change algorithms if we need to.
Yeah, you could always do the old-fashioned sort sheet, and based on the number of items in the input, pick which algorithm, and therefore for smaller numbers you can just use the optimal, but still feel safe if somebody goes truly crazy in the number of templates.
Right. And the idea would be to implement just one algorithm first for speed of implementation. But then the concern would be to make sure whatever assumptions you build in, right, either build an approximate one because it's faster or build out this ideal one because it's more thorough or whatever. At some point, those assumptions are going to hit some kind of breaking limit, right? If we go with the fancy one, the optimal algorithm, it's going to break at a certain scale. And you just want to make sure if it becomes clear that you're going to hit that scale, you've left enough room to code up something different and for that to be released and to propagate. So users, aren't left sort of triaging which templates they want to have on their cluster or something like that.
I just am suspecting that probably the number of templates will probably break the cluster far before this is anywhere close to being a CPU bound problem. But I'll put my notes on there.
Yeah, maybe. Like I'm just describing the structure of the decision, not necessarily the decision itself, because I don't have the numbers either. Sorry, but anyway, that the questions like that are I think salient to the doc, right? And more to the point. Oh, it looks like there's comments now on the doc. If I remember right, Alex, correct me if I'm wrong here. The concern was just getting eyes on the thing so that we know that people aren't like fundamentally objecting to the approach. Is that right?
Yeah. We wanted to like have this discussion basically.
And so, Rita, do you see any blocking concerns or?
No, I think, high level looks great. I think it's a matter of just, I guess, seeing, like, do a quick POC just to see what the experience looks like, and then we can probably have better feedback. But I think high level wise, it looks great.
Gotcha. Okay. So how I would then interpret that, Alex and Rita, stop me if I'm wrong here, is like, feel free to go ahead prototyping, but having more clarity on the doc in terms of, to the extent that the comments have had some branches in the discussion, we should make those concrete.
Yeah, and also, like, I think this is a general feedback for all of our design docs. We do a really good job of giving feedback, discussing the comments and in meetings like this, but I don't think all the design docs necessarily capture the decisions a lot of times. And I think for someone who is like trying to implement based on the design doc or going back to why was this decision made, right? It is really hard to grok because a lot of the really key reasons are actually in the comments, and they were never actually brought back to the doc. Which is unfortunate. So maybe this is one thing we can call out as what was the final decision. Maybe we need some kind of like doc template or something. I don't know.
Comments are searchable now, which is awesome.
Yeah, but again, it doesn't capture decision, right? It's like, oh, it was a thread that we went back and forth on, but was that the decision? I don't know.
Right. It's in this meeting, for instance, Andrew and I's discussion, there's no way to re-reference it from the doc if people were curious.
Maybe we need like a table that says like approved or something. And it doesn't get approved until like all the comments are in.
Sounds like a KEP thing.
Yeah. I mean, that requires more like formal thing.
Yeah. Like, to be honest, I don't know if any design doc like fully solves this problem, right? Like KEPs have code review comments, for sure. But then there's also meetings on the side, right? Where people discuss things that like alter the contents of the KEP. And if that's between one person and the author before they really get a review on the KEP, like that also won't hit the comments.
Should we have gaps?
What's this?
I said gap, gatekeeper enhancement proposal. I mean, you laugh, but like, I don't know. Like, I think cluster API has something like cat, like C, like caps. Anyway.
Gatekeeper excellence convergence concept, the GEC. A Fallout reference.
So before we move on, I just took some notes, and they should be what we talked about. I'm also tagging Anlan to be like, feel free to go POC. If any of you looks at these notes and it's like, that's not what we talked about, Alex, feel free to change them. But I think they're accurate.
Well, yes, but we should also concretize the design doc in parallel to prototyping.
Gotcha.
Yeah, I put this here because I think, we're done with 313, just waiting for the feedbacks, right? I think next Tuesday, whenever August 8th is, it is the release, when we're gonna cut the 313 release. So this is just 314. Some of these were rollover from last release, and some were just new. I want to make sure we agree this is what we want to get in for the next release. And if there are other items that y'all think we should definitely prioritize on, I think, feel free to add the label and then we can discuss together.
I'll also add these issues to the board here and just leave them in no iteration for now, but make sure that they're all on here. Yeah.
So we're cutting the release this week, like this Friday.
Next week, the 313 would be next Tuesday.
Yeah, August 8th. Oh, by the way, we try not to cut releases on Fridays.
Oh,
It always ends up on Friday though.
I don't
Not
think
this
all of
time,
them.
I think like
Tuesday.
the majority of them on Friday.
I
think
mean-
that's the best way to push the prod is the best time at 4 p.m. possibly on the West Coast time.
I hate to tell you, I end up with a lot of Monday releases these days is what I find as my solution to solving that problem.
To be fair, just because we've cut a release doesn't mean people need to use that release. But yeah, newcomers will get the fresh code, I think, is the one edge case there.
I think it's all the automated at latest polls everywhere in the world is probably the big problem.
Which are Helm chart and manifest.
You don't have late ones. Yeah.
Oh, well, I was gonna say I've got something that actually will I've got an API for updating other repos that will literally just grab all the releases, sort them by version order, and grab the latest, even if there's not a tag. So yeah.
Gotcha.
I guess if you did Helm install, then yeah, they'll get the latest one.
Cool. Yeah, I guess like Rita said, start thinking about what you'd want to include in here, and then I'll add to that. This iteration on our board, we're halfway through. So start considering like what you'd like to add to iteration 2. And then we'll set aside some time during next week's meeting to just make sure that we are in shape for this next block.
Sounds good, yo.
Well, with 2 minutes to spare, I'm gonna drop.
Thank you all.
Talk to y'all later.
Bye.
Bye, everybody. Have a great day.
Ah.